She surfaced from a fog of color and fever to the weight of unfamiliar sheets and the sharp, antiseptic light of a hotel room that smelled faintly of citrus and carpet cleaners. For a heart-stopping second, she did not know where she was. Her fingers, streaked with a stubborn smudge of cadmium red she could not explain, fluttered to her temple, finding only the residual buzz of something that had not been wine. Memories came in fragments, laughter at the gallery, a ribbon of incense curling through the air, a hand touching the back of her neck at the edge of the crowd, the sudden warmth of dizziness like a blanket thrown over her senses. A man was sitting at the edge of the bed, his suit unruffled, his face implacable in the way of men who had never had to ask for anything. He held a mug of coffee with both hands as if it were a thing to be contemplated, not consumed. He watched her the way one watches a painting, cold, appraising, inscrutable. Freya's name, an alias she used every time she put brush to canvas and hid behind the softer daffodil signature, was still a breath within her, fragile and private. The man's voice cut across the small room like a straight line. "Say it." The command was not loud, it held the weight of a verdict. Freya tried to sit up. Her abdomen protested with a hollow ache she couldn't name. The room tilted, the ceiling shifting into a pattern that looked suspiciously like dried Venetian plaster. "What?" she began, but her voice came out thin. "Call me husband," he said. "Say it, for the staff, for whoever tries to use the story against you." It was not an offer, it was a strategy, a single blunt blade of social optics. She stared at him, a mixture of outrage, humiliation, and the animal instinct for shelter. The idea of marrying a stranger, of being labeled as his in any sense, scalded her with indignation. She had spent most of her life unlabeled, invisible in a way she had learned to treat like armor. To be called someone's wife, even in name only, was to trade one kind of erasure for another. "You can't," she started. He cut her off by rising, the movement precise and economical. He reached for a robe on a chair and draped it over her shoulders with a touch that was almost gentle, if still cool. "When you get drugged in a room full of vultures, you either become a headline or a protected thing," he said. "Choose." The coffee steamed at the edge of his words. He was older than her by a decade easily, hair gone at the temples, a jaw that, the tabloids would later call it, belonged to a man who never showed his patience. He had the sort of presence that filled a room without needing to raise his voice. The reserve was the point. He had the sort of wealth that could buy silence, and more dangerously, the sort that could declare a fact public and make everyone accept it. Freya thought of the gallery, the way the candles had been lit, the way someone had slipped an ornate sachet into her coat, as if it were a polite compliment. She thought of chestnuts darkened in a pan, of the Yelton family toasting to the success of Cordelia, her glossy sister figure who smiled with an ease Freya had never learned to wear. Her skin tightened in the memory of Gail Yelton's ledger, the caretaker's precise handwriting that turned Freya's nights into numbers for sale. "Say it," the man repeated. There was no anger in it. There was simply the unadorned efficiency of a man who understood a system and meant to manipulate it before it could destroy someone. She wanted to say no. She wanted to push back, to spit in his face and tell him she would rather be eaten alive by gossip than be paraded under anyone else's name. And yet the coffee and robe and the way the city's windows at that hour leaked with a quiet that felt like a threat, there was logic in his demand. She had learned to measure the world in choices between unpleasant things and worse things. This felt like one of those crossroads. She said it because in the bare calculation made by someone who had nothing but art and truth, protection mattered. "Husband," she repeated, the word catching like a brush dragged across rough canvas. He let the mug rise in a small mock toast, and then returned it to the table as if that settled the world. "Good," he said. "If anyone asks, you came back to my room after the show. They won't touch you." That night, if night it could be called, fell over her like a wash of gray paint. She listened as he spoke in clipped sentences about calling Aiden, about the hotel staff, about contacting no one in public, about a car that would come at dawn. He used little words like seals. She watched the way he wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, and the way his fingers brushed a wayward thread from the fabric. No tenderness anywhere, and yet something oddly considerate humming in the economy of his actions. She never learned his name in the first hour. He allowed her time to regain herself before dropping that detail like another tool to frame events. Adonis Leland, he said finally, as if introducing himself were a fact that needed little flourish. Freya repeated his name under her breath like a spell she wasn't sure she believed. He noted nothing in her expression. He was a man used to neutrality being interpreted as compliance. He didn't offer to call the police, he didn't threaten. Instead, he offered leverage, something about him she realized later that made the whole city listen before it judged. If someone had filmed that exchange and sold the footage, the headlines would have been obscene and appetites eager. Instead, the only witnesses were the bed, the coffee, the hotel's thin plaster, and the way the city murmured under the window. In the weeks that followed, that morning would be retold in a dozen less accurate ways. People would call it a scandal, some would call it a mistake, some would call it a romance for those who liked their tragedies neatly packaged. But in the rawness of the early hours, it was a woman who had been made vulnerable by another person's cruelty, and a man who chose to use the social armor of a label to keep the vultures at bay. She would learn, slowly, how he invited the world to read that label. He wore his cold like a shield, and his shield had a sharp edge. If you're hooked by this scandalous beginning, hit like and subscribe to see how Freya fights back. The gallery where it had started sat across from an old bookstore that still kept its window full of forgotten atlases. On the night she had been drugged, the gallery had been bright and intimate, the sort of room that smelled of linseed oil and wax, and the faint metallic tang that artistic life seems always to carry. People had come wearing the slick armor of influence, tailored coats, teeth that flashed with the right vocabulary, bouquets for the prettiest face. Freya had not been meant to be there in any official capacity. She had gone because the painting Cordelia was not hers, actually hung in the largest space. Cordelia was the family's satin-coated brand, smile, socialite, heir to the Yelton estate. Freya's life, meanwhile, had been built in the thin grey attic above the Yelton carriage house. Slanted ceilings, a single window that refused to frame much of anything, a heady world of pigment where she snuck away at night to paint what her hands could not afford to sign. She had painted on the edges, in secret sessions after midnight, when the house slept, and the family's laughter was distant enough to be background noise. She called herself Daffodil on the rare occasions her work met a buyer, because the name sounded delicate and anonymous. The signature was a tiny promise to herself that even if the world took her face, it could not take what she made. Her work, brushwork so personal and full of a tiny recurring flourish, the leftward sweep at the end of an iris, a faint anchoring scrape in the underlayer, became Cordelia's talent on lists, in galleries, in interviews with people who liked their myths neat. Gail Yelton kept ledgers. Gail kept receipts. There was nothing sentimental in Gail's accounting. Human lives were margins in the columns. The ledger that mattered was a fat book bound in leather, full of names, payments, numbers that described what each person in the household provided and what they cost. Freya once watched him with that ledger, a candle throwing his shadow long on the wall, and realized the ledger was the family's conscience. When she painted, she did it in the intervals between the counting of her worth and the theft of it. Cordelia, for all her charm and incomprehensible ease in front of cameras, had a complicated place in the machine. She had been groomed to play the role. To the world she was merely dimly incompetent, but polite, and that was part of the brand. To Freya she was a figure of pity and anger both. A woman who did not know which of the family's narratives belonged to her, and which were sewn over someone else's body. Cordelia smiled with a practiced openness. When she sat for photographs, someone, Gail, a manager, an interior decorator, would place a canvas near her, as if proximity to art made an appearance more believable. The Yelton household functioned like an ecosystem built around a single voracious predator. Freya was sure, continually, that the family loved its image more than it loved itself. It was a small mercy, she told herself, that art existed at all under those conditions because art, in a way, was the only thing that could be stolen and still be sanctified when it left the house. Zane had been the most immediate predator that night. He was a name that felt like a betrayal, warm handshakes in corridors, invitations to after-parties, whispered promises, and then later, slips. He had told her he saw something in her. He had told her he liked her thick strokes and the way she cut color. He had kissed her in a doorway between the gallery and the kitchen, and said soft things about running away and becoming more than a ghost. He would later claim he had helped her. It was small comfort when the thing he tried to help with was a cup of wine laced with something that made her head swim like a storm. A stolen scent, a stranger's hand. Somewhere in the press of festivities, someone had dosed a sachet under the pretense of aromatics, incense that slowly released a thin poison into her breath. People did not always need a vial. Sometimes they needed only to borrow your will for a few hours. She remembered the room bending, remembered a plume of sweetness like an old perfume, the world tilting into soft cotton. It was a thing designed to take capacity away, the ability to say no, the ability to consent, the ability to stand in your own skin. When she woke in the hotel room with a man she had never met before, the outrage that mounted inside her had a sharp, righteous edge. She wanted to call Gail. She wanted to call the police and have the whole arrangement open like the flap of a whale. Gail would have turned it into a ledger entry and a negotiation. The police would have let gossip begin again without protection for the woman who had been taken. Vultures would have circled with their own journals and hashtags. Adonis offered something different. He offered control of the narrative. He offered, whether he intended to or not, the chance to stop the initial bite of the first predators. By the afternoon after they left the hotel, Adonis insisted on dropping her at a small clinic first, made sure she was seen, signed with a sterile efficiency that felt like a contract. He made a public move that looked like a monolith. He purchased, anonymously at first, and then publicly, a daffodil painting from a modest auction that had been sniffed at by Yelton agents. The painting, small and raw, had been labeled as an early Cordelia study by gallery hands. The brushstrokes were, unmistakably to Freya, her own. The leftward iris flick, the underlayer scrape. She had painted it in the attic using the last of the Gamblin pigment she had saved for months. Money had been poured into laughter and champagne in the upper rooms of Gallery Voss that evening, but no one expected the man who had been seen with a stranger to step onto the floor and raise his paddle with a quiet single movement that ended the bidding. A hush fell. Newsfeeds would later call it the sudden purchase that rewrote a night, and Adonis Leland paid triple the painting's expected price. He then, without theatrics, ensured the paperwork tied the painting to an advisory fund in Freya's name. He set up an account with enough seed money to give her a roof that was not slanted, and a lawyer who knew how to say fraud without pity. When the cameras asked why he had done it, his voice was the same as in the hotel, controlled, non-committal. "She paints," he said. "That should count for something." It was a meaningless sentence in the mouths of some men, but in his it cut like a legal precedent. The press loved the drama of the rescued artist. They swept around the edges and licked at the story without ever once focusing on the crime. Freya learned quickly that rescue by wealth lands on different columns in headline economies. The otherwise damning sequence of events became fodder for speculation, for stylized op-eds about fame and consent, for an industry that loved to romanticize ruin. Adonis's interference created ripples in the Yelton household. Gail's ledger grew more anxious and petty. He moved numbers around the same way a gambler moves denominations on a felt table. Cordelia's face, which had been trained to the camera, began to hole with panic in private. There were whispered conversations and veiled threats that floated like moths near the flame of public curiosity. Gail made sure to say the right things to the right people, to call the right socialites who filled chairs at the right events. But money cannot tidy everything. There are stains that refuse to rub out, and Freya's quiet anger had the persistence of a primer coat. Being given money and a law firm did not settle the ache of being seen as someone else's talent. Being given shelter did not stitch shut the place in her chest where proprietary hands had reached and catalogued her value. At the edge of this upheaval stood Aidan, Adonis's subordinate, who was good at doing the physical labor of protection. He was the man who fetched documents, who babysat the details people like Adonis were too grand to notice. Aidan's loyalty was composed of small acts that did not scream heroism, arranging meetings, sitting in the corner of a cafe until a frightened witness felt safe enough to speak, offering a rough hand to help carry a box of canvases that smelled like turpentine and cotton. Aidan listened to Freya when she wanted to talk about brushes and pigments, not about trauma. He listened to Adonis when his boss needed a cynic to echo back a plan he could not afford to humanize. For all that Adonis's hand in her life had the feel of ownership, it was also his shield against the family's more brutal tactics. He used his coldness strategically. In boardrooms, he could be ruthless. When he faced the Yeltons, he was blunt. He told Gale, once, without flourish, that any attempt to auction off paintings without the artist's consent would be met by litigation and public exposure. Gale laughed until the laugh died at the rim, then put away the ledger as if it had suddenly become irrelevant. Freya was, for reasons she was only beginning to understand, the pivot of a game that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with power. People on the outside would read it differently. She would be tempted to read it differently herself, to let gratitude for protection blur into dependence. But a truth she carried as stubbornly as a stroke. The paint came from her palms. The life she wanted was not simply safety. She wanted her art to be her own. Adonis understood the value of spectacle. He understood the theater of a label in a way that made him dangerous and useful. Once, in a private moment when the city had gone to sleep and the cranes chiseled silhouettes on the horizon, he spoke to her about names and shields. "If someone can call you my wife and watch the vultures climb back into their cages," he said, "they will." She said nothing. She wanted to say that labels were not shields but cages, that a name could be weaponized against a person, that there was a difference between being protected and being possessed. Instead, she thought of the little evidence she could marshal: a leftover sachet with exotic resin found behind the gallery draperies, a receipt from a drugstore where someone had purchased a small bottle under an alias, the faint indentation on the underside of Cordelia's studio easel that matched the scraping pattern Freya used to anchor her canvases. Those clues, small and patient, could be arranged into a pattern only if someone listened. Adonis listened. He paid attention to the leftward iris. He watched, he bought art, and he bought silence. But the exchange that had started with his cold demand in a hotel would extend into social strata. At first a private tactical command at dawn, later a public spectacle when he announced himself as her protector in the mouths of the city's gossip mills. She did not like how much she had to consider the angle of other people's eyes now, but she had always measured the world that way. The attic had taught her the economy of invisibility. You made yourself small, then you surprised them later with the force of your work. She had plans in the attic that night, to go back, to collect evidence, to find the little burn mark beneath a rug that only the servants knew about, to track ledgers into the corners of Gale's closet. Cordelia's role in all this was less simple than the world assumed. Cordelia was not an evil twin. She was a woman raised in a house that taught her to be a pretty face, and sometimes pretty faces signed the wrong check. There were moments when Freya watched Cordelia in galleries and felt pity. There was a woman under her satin, uncertain which life she was allowed to live. Cordelia apologized once in a whisper when no one was listening, her mascara smeared by guilt. The apology did nothing to fix the ledger, but it revealed that the human machinery behind the fraud had places where conscience could be wounded. Freya planned small acts of vengeance, legal complaints, public demonstrations, a methodical unpeeling of the gilded onion, until the Yeltons had little more to hold up as dignity. She planned for the competition. The Academy naively called it a test of merit. Everyone knew it was also a marketplace for reputations. If she could stand at that stage and show the world the signature that belonged to the hand that painted Cordelia's canvases, then the ledger might be torn in public. Adonis, who was not a man prone to sentiment, helped her refine the plan. He suggested one crucial thing: proof had to be undeniable. In art, proof lived in the hand. Judges and collectors were not necessarily equipped to parse ethics. They could, however, be persuaded by a brushstroke. "What you need," he said one evening as they sat in a warehouse lit by a single arc lamp while Aidan laid out canvases like pieces in a chess set, "is a demonstration that leaves no room for mistake or coincidence, a straight-handed show, technique that screams authorship." Freya's jaw worked as she thought. She had a peace in mind. Years in a small corner of the attic, a canvas half-finished that had become a ledger of her life. It was a canvas that included a private lament, an underpainting I had used only once before, a mix of ultramarine and a pinch of bone black, grilled with a tool that left a scar only she knew how to make. If she could finish it in the light of the Academy, against a canvas put side by side with one of Cordelia's supposed masterpieces, the contrast would be cruel and clean. Adonis nodded once, as if that were settled. "I'll arrange a comparison," he said. "We make the scene public. Everyone watches both of you paint. We bring in witnesses. We bring in the ledger. She felt a sharp thrill at that. It was a plan that used the same public world that had been a predator to turn the light back onto those who had abused it. She felt, dangerously, a tremor of trust. It was not affection. It was the odd tethered relief of having an ally whose resources matched his will. Not everyone in his orbit approved. The Nicole family, who had a social understanding with the Lelands, did not like messy theatre. There were calls to Adonis from high towers and marble-paneled rooms where people discussed reputations in tones that oppressed like velvet. The Leland name carried weight. The Nicole's silent disapproval could pull at contracts and potential alliances. "It would be messy," Adonis heard them say. "There will be collateral. A man does not step into another's status and rearrange the city without costs." Adonis let the costs mount like numbers on a balance sheet. For him, the calculus was clear. A woman painted into servitude needed a partner with means to stand in her name until she stood in her own. For Freya, the calculus was full of aversion. She wanted to climb onto the podium by the strength of her work, not by the press of a man's hand at her elbow. Yet to make the climb, sometimes you needed scaffolding. As the days went by, the scaffolding grew more elaborate. Lawyers drafted letters. Gallery owners whispered. A small circle of trusted people began to orbit Freya's life. Adonis, his assistant Aiden, Master Moonlight, a mentor with ink-stained fingers who had once taught Freya at a public workshop and who now shuffled in with sympathy and a scolding for her if she let her anger become vanity. Each of them became a node in a network of protection and strategy. Freya returned to the attic once to gather what remained of her past life. The room smelled the way night houses do, dust and the faint mildew of old canvases. She packed the things that mattered least to others and most to her. A bag of brushes softened by years. Tubes of paint with names that read like family. A small wooden box containing a faded photograph of a woman who might have been her mother if anyone had ever asked the right questions. There was a small butterfly-shaped birthmark on her throat, hidden by time, and a necklace worn for no reason but habit. It was a trivial, stubborn thing, but it held power. Aunt Meadow, who had hummed in the background of Freya's childhood, a woman who taught her to mix colors, had told her the mark was a sign of lineage. If she found her origins, if she could prove she had a name beyond the ledger's columns, then the Yeltons' claim could be made both false and cruel. She packed the birthmark into her mind as a talisman. Proof, she decided, would not be solely about paint. It would be about identities too. The ledger listed only who made their livelihood off her. It did not list who she was. She would gather both kinds of evidence. It was when she least expected it that Adonis reminded her of what power language could wield. At a small late-night meeting in his office, where the lights were soft and his view of the city looked like a host of black dominoes punctuated by glowing squares, he said once more, with the same bluntness he had used in the hotel room, "You will be safer if people believe we are, at the very least, attached." Her anger flared. "Attached? You're asking me to play your wife in a drama." "I'm asking you to reduce the odds," he said. "Call me husband, Freya, for a time, as a shield, as a strategy. If we are under the same name, they will pause before they move." She understood then the trade he was offering, his public name for her safety. It was not love. It was not even respect in the way she meant it. It was an exchange executed on a battlefield where the currency was social assumption. To accept it felt like surrender. To refuse felt like recklessness. She thought of the painting in the attic, the one she would take to the academy. She thought of Aiden, who unloaded boxes with hands that had the kind of gentleness that did not require words. She thought of Master Moonlight, who had looked at her and said once, "You must paint like the world is listening whether it is or not." "Say it," he said then, not as a command but as a question, observing the small war she waged in the flex of her jaw. She said it again, because the world in which she lived often demanded concessions before it would grant a moment of grace. "Husband," she whispered, not for him and not for the world, but because the sound felt, in that small room of glass and steel, like the one thing that might buy her the time to take a canvas and put both the Yeltons and the Leland's scrutiny into clear public frame. There would be people who later called his demand possessive. There would be others who praised his decisiveness. For Freya, in those first days, the demand was a narrow alley through which she had to walk. It was a strange kind of armor, heavy and uncomfortable, but armor nonetheless. And the city watched. The auction houses kept their records. The academy scheduled its spring duel. The Yelton ledger simmered. Adonis sharpened his social blade. Freya sat in the quiet of her tiny temporary studio and turned her wrist to the left, practicing the flick that had always been her secret signature. She painted with fury and the coldness of a person who had the memory of hands on her throat. She painted to leave a mark that could not be pedaled away. The stage was being set, and the air tasted like rain on concrete before a storm. The days between the hotel morning and the academy duel moved like a paper fan folding open, each new fold revealing a rumor, a lawyer's scrawl, a phone call that smelled faintly of threat. Freya worked as if the hours themselves were pigments to be mixed, measured, exact, careful. She painted until her shoulder ached, and the leftward flick, the small private habit that had been her fingerprint for a decade, felt like the only language she could trust. Every canvas became an argument. Master Moonlight came and went with the certainty of tide. He had long ago taught her how to see the way a canvas kept its secrets, the way an underpainting could be coaxed into confession by the right light, the right solvent, the right observer. He showed her, again and again, how to put a mark into a painting that could not be imitated without a name tucked into the hand's memory. "Make it sing like a bone," he'd say. "Make it scar in the way only you can scar it." She finished the attic canvas in a week of almost unbearable focus. The piece, she called it in her mind the ledger, was a riot of ultramarine and bone black, a central eye that refused to look straight at the viewer, edged with that signature scrape in the underlayer. In the low light of her temporary studio, it felt like a thing that remembered the hands that had made it. Adonis watched the process in those quiet hours. Not a constant presence, but a figure who arrived when meetings and boardrooms unclenched enough to allow him out into the city's night. He asked few questions about sorrow or trauma. He interrogated decisions. "Finish it the way you began," he told her once. "No apologizing, no theatrics. Make them uncomfortable with the truth of a hand that won't be reduced." Freya sometimes wanted to resent him for the coldness with which he smoothed the edges of her life, for the way he had asked her to use the label husband as armor. But resentment is a complex color, sometimes rich, sometimes ugly, sometimes necessary. It did not preclude gratitude for the way he had used his influence to reach into the Yelton ledger and lift the thick, corrupt weight from her shoulders. It did not stop her from noticing how he sat very still when she spoke of the sachet and the way the world had stopped being her own that night. The Yeltons moved like a distressed animal. Gale, who had once counted people like currency, began to count consequences instead. Phone calls that asked for explanations he did not have, and humiliations in the form of polite invitations withdrawn. Cordelia, who had been taught to tilt the world toward charm, found that people were no longer willing to let charm set the terms. Her smile became a brittle thing. She had the look of someone learning the geography of shame. There were small moments of soft complicity too. Cordelia came to see Freya one rainy afternoon, her umbrella dripping on the cheap mat of the studio entrance. She did not bring platitudes or excuses. She brought a small box of paints, something Freya had once coveted and never dared claim. She sat across from Freya and said, in a voice that trembled with something like fear and something like sorrow, "I don't know where to start. I never asked. I'm sorry." Freya did not soften at once. The ledger's columns had been carved into her memory, but Cordelia's tear-streaked face, the way her mascara had bled into the small ravines along her nose, suggested not villainy, but a person who had been trained into a part. There was pity, and then there was strategy. Freya understood that a public unmasking that ended with Cordelia reduced to a grotesque pantomime would do little to repair the deeper injustice, the system that had rendered artistry into a commodity owned by others. "Tell the truth," Freya said simply. "If you cannot do that, then tell me what you mean to do after you tell it." Cordelia's apology was a beginning, messy and humbling. She confessed small things that meant everything. She admitted to signing checks she was told to sign, to naming paintings she had not seen emerge from a hand in the attic. The confession was a light strip through the dark ledger. It did not undo the theft, but it gave Freya a variable she could work with, someone from inside the machine who could testify to the mechanics of the fraud. Freya took the confession and folded it into the case she was building. She met with lawyers who spoke in careful, cold syllables. She sat with Master Moonlight while he traced the underlayers of her pieces and advised on conservators who could demonstrate authorship to the kind of people who would otherwise prefer ambiguity. She did not like the trade, art reduced to demonstration, but she needed the kind of undeniable evidence that would make the Yelton ledger seem less like rumor and more like confession. Adonis was meticulous in the way he marshaled resources. He did not show off. He did not make speeches. He arranged for a conservator, an academic friend of Master Moonlight's who knew the vocabulary of pigment and could speak its grammar, to examine the ledger under raking light and with a small, non-invasive technique that revealed the forensic history of a canvas. There were micro-scrapings in the underpainting that matched the exact pattern of her secret mark. There was a layer of shellac only she used because she had learned to preserve a particular hue in a certain way. Evidence, small and precise, began to gather into a shape that could not be scoffed at by the gossiping columns. Meanwhile, the Academy's competition, rumored to be nothing more than a marketplace of reputations, tightened its date. It would be public, televised, the kind of event that delighted in spectacle and punishments alike. For those who fed on scandal, the night promised a banquet. For Freya, it was a crucible. There were backstage skirmishes. The Nicole family, who had long stood at the elbow of powerful people like a hand on their sleeve, dialed Adonis with thinly veiled threats. "This will damage partnerships," one of their spokespeople told him in language that had the weight of contracts behind it. They suggested that marrying your employees, or the appearance of doing so, was a liability. They implied board discomfort, shareholder murmurs. They offered the quiet pressure of consequences measured in meetings with men in dark ties. Adonis listened and then made a decision that surprised even those who had long watched him. He had always been a strategist who valued leverage and precision. But leverage without mercy was simply a machine. He chose to shoulder the reputational blow. "We will do what is necessary," he said. "If that costs alliances, then let them fall away. I am not in the business of letting someone be prey when there is a way to change the odds." There were those who said later that his decision was performative, that he loved the stage, but the truth of his posture was simpler. He had the means and the will, and the calculus to him was not romance but chance. He wanted Freya to have the time and space to make her own life. For him that was all the emotion he needed. Affection, if it grew, would follow. Aiden, who had been the hands-on protector and the man who hauled canvases and arranged improbable logistics, found his own story bending. He had spent his life in the service of a boss who liked to command. Protecting Freya had softened something in him. A recognition that the small kindnesses that meant nothing in board meeting minutes could mean everything in a life. He stood beside her at low-level meetings and watched her show no small flashes of humor amid her straighter lines. When the court of public opinion began to murmur, he was the one who would step into a doorway to calm a photographer or walk a trembling witness to safety. In the quiet after a long day, he would hand her a tea that was still too hot and say nothing, an intimacy small enough to be dignified. The night of the Academy duel felt like weather. The auditorium smelled of varnish and hot breath. Lights cut through the air like scalpels. Reporters slipped their pens into their faces as if to write faster than the moment could move. Freya's entry in the duel was placed opposite Cordelia's. 2 women, 2 canvases, the world watching to see whether theft could be made clear in the language of paint. The rules were bare. Each would execute a painting in a set time, witnesses would observe, and a panel would comment on merit. Freya's hand felt steady. She had practiced the leftward flick until it felt less like a gesture and more like a syllable of a language she had been denied. Cordelia sat down with a face that had learned to be photogenic, but she faltered. The rapidity of a live performance demands not just the knowledge of what to do, but the muscle memory to do it. Cordelia had not been the creator the gallery said she was. Her hand betrayed that. She hesitated, then hurried, then hesitated again. The judges murmured. Adonis sat in the reserved row, expression as unreadable as ever. Aiden was beside him, quietly present, and Master Moonlight watched with a light like moonlight held in his palms. The conservator sat near the judges with the small instruments of her trade, ready. Freya painted not for applause, but for the telling of truth. She began with the underdrawing she had prepared, an element she had hidden in the attic canvas and which she reused as a cipher. The technique was subtle. It was in the scraping and the judicious application of a ratio of ultramarine to bone black that she had only ever used in intimate pieces. Under raking light, when master moonlight could call for it, the underlayer would speak the way it had been forced to speak in the private attic. As she worked, she felt the weight of every year she had given to the household compress into a single lean motion. She painted the leftward sweep again and again until the motion felt like breathing. Each stroke was a letter in the argument she had been making without words since her hand first tasted paint. The drama began to unspool when the conservator, at Adonis's request and with the Academy's permission, ran a non-invasive reflectography over both canvases. The screen showed, slowly and with clinical brightness, the hidden underlayers. The sequence of marks on Cordelia's supposed masterpiece did not match those in the attic canvas. The conservator then held up the raking light for both and asked for a small, simple demonstration to see whether Cordelia could recreate the single underscrape that had become Freya's sign. Cordelia tried. Her hand trembled. The scrape looked like a stranger's attempt to speak in a language she had not been taught. The public leaned forward. Freya, watching from the stage, felt the long chamber of the audience like an echo. Evidence stacked itself like a column of facts. The conservator, with the precision of someone who had spent years listening to paintings, pointed out the micro-variations, the way the underlayer had been scorched by a particular solvent, the peculiar depth of the bone black. This was not accident. This was habit. This was hand. Gale's calm evaporated. He stood, face contradicting the composure he had always displayed. Others in his circle moved like moths being swatted. Cordelia's manager tried to intervene with a soothing statement, but the audience's mood had shifted. Whispers turned into a low roar. Then Gale, in a desperate gamble, tried to seize the studio microphone. "This is a private matter," he began, voice high with panic. "Accusations." Adonis rose. He did not shout. He did not look like a man delivering a pronouncement. He looked like a man who had decided a line needed to be cut. "No," he said quietly, with the precision of a man cutting through fog. "This is a matter of theft." It was then he did something that would be replayed for weeks on morning shows and social feeds. He stepped forward, placed one hand lightly at Freya's shoulder, and, because the camera coveted spectacle, he spoke in a tone designed to both protect and provoke. "She is my wife," he said. The line landed like a thunderclap. There was an intake of breath. The auditorium held its collective breath in the precise moment between the truth's exposure and the social maneuver intended to reframe it. People blinked, eyes wide, some scandalized, others intrigued. Freya felt a comet of anger and humiliation pass through her. She had agreed to this gambit as a tactic. She recognized the mechanism of the label. But she also saw, in the faces of the Yelton contingent, the tilt from profit to danger. Gale made a small choking sound. Cordelia's face collapsed into something like release and something like fear. Adonis's voice, when he repeated the statement in interviews later, was blunt and efficient. On the stage, he made it clear. This was a social barrier thrown up to blunt the knives. "Anyone who claims your work as their own will have to claim you as their property," he said to the room. "That is not a transaction I will allow those vultures to make." The crowd reacted in a tide. Some applauded, not for the stunt, but for the spectacle of a man with means using those means to change the narrative. Others hissed at the implied performance. But in the world that valued appearances, his public pronouncement clawed space for her. The conservator presented the final piece of evidence, Gale's ledger, hauled reluctantly from the Yelton household by Cordelia's shaky admission and the careful work of a lawyer. It listed sales, consignments, agent cuts, lines that translated human labor into percentages. The ledger's columns were as damning as they were precise. In the margin was a note, "Daffodil pieces, attic supply." The handwriting was Gale's. In a sequence that felt like a guillotine swinging, the Academy suspended the Yeltons' privileges pending investigation. Press cameras swarmed, and social media, which had previously fixated on scandal as entertainment, was forced to compute the arithmetic of theft and exploitation. Cordelia, in public, sobbed and then apologized, an apology that was not theatrical but raw. Adonis, having used the label wife as a shield, did not gloat. Instead, he manipulated the publicity into truth-making. He arranged for the ledger to be copied to legal counsel, for the conservator's report to be filed in a way that could withstand legal scrutiny, for Cordelia's confession to be witnessed and notarized. Truth became a series of careful documents. Freya, for the first time in her life, felt the machinery of accountability move in her favor. It was not immediate relief. Nothing in that night felt immediate and uncomplicated, but it felt like motion in the right direction. The public spectacle had given her an opening. The legal process had given her vocabulary in a way the Academy Duels drama had not. In the days that followed, Gale tried to spin. He hired PR. He wrote stiff statements in which he claimed ignorance, in which he painted himself as a benevolent guardian who had merely helped polish a raw gem into a customer-ready product. People who had once celebrated Cordelia's talent began to ask themselves what they had really been applauding. The Yelton household's social invitations dried up. Contracts were pulled. The ledgers were used as evidence rather than as tools of negotiation. Freya's birthmark, the small butterfly on her throat that she had carried in her pocket like a coin of inheritance, became a hinge in another part of the story. Aunt Meadow, who had been a minor figure in her early life but who knew the quiet languages of memory and birth records, tracked down a midwife who recalled a child with a butterfly mark given to a woman who had worked at a nearby textile mill nearly 22 years earlier. The midwife's memory was a small, stubborn thing, the sort of human data that only needs corroboration. A name was unearthed from an old registry, Eleanor Hart. It sounded like an accusation and a cure at once. Freya, Eleanor, felt the syllable like a found object. She went to the registrar's office with Master Moonlight and the lawyer, and in a stack of brittle forms she found a birth certificate that matched the midwife's testimony. The certificate listed a woman who had disappeared from the records under pressure and a man who had been recorded as a transient. There's a way in which bureaucracy is both cruel and redemptive. The same system that allows people to be erased can sometimes be the one that restores them when a clerk reads the right line. The reunion with her mother was not cinematic. It came in the form of a woman who smelled faintly of soap and smoke, who stood at the doorway of a small apartment 3 blocks from the river, and who looked at Freya as if she were both a stranger and an echo. Their conversation was full of halting admissions and apologies. Freya learned that her mother had been young, that someone had made promises she could not hold, that a man had frightened her into silence. There was no tidy origin story of inheritance and romance. There were only broken promises and the slow work of human forgivings. The confirmation of identity, Eleanor Hart, was complicated by the legal mechanics of adoption and bookkeeping. But it gave Freya something no ledger could take, an origin she could name. It meant the Yelton's ledger had been instrumental in obscuring a life, and it meant that the nation's administrative machinery could, when pressed, give back a name. The legal proceedings meandered through civil hearings. Gale, when faced with the ledger and Cordelia's testimony, attempted a public apology that read like a man who had learned the vocabulary of contrition and then attempted to deploy it as a shield. The court of social opinion, hungry as always for spectacle, demanded consequences. The Yeltons were fined, their galleries blacklisted by a handful of reputable institutions, and Cordelia, whose redemption arc was not simple, volunteered to step back from the public eye and enroll in a conservatory to learn the craft she had once sold with others' hands. It was not punishment enough for some, and it was a beginning for others. Amid the legal and social unspooling, Freya's art found notice on its own terms. The Academy's board voted to admit her into the association with provisional credentials pending the outcome of the case. But the conservator's report and the public demonstration had done more than persuade a panel of judges. They gave Freya the oxygen of legitimacy in a world that valued proof above gesture. Galleries that once would have sniffed at her now wrote sincere notes that were not quite solicitations. Master Moonlight smiled in a way that was almost proud and almost fatherly. He told her once, with a rare softness, "You make truth in a way that does not always require witnesses, but it helps to bring them." For all the victories, the nights were not free of tension. Freya wrestled with the sense that she had stepped into a life that had been arranged for her by people with more power and less tenderness. Adonis's insistence on the label husband had saved her from immediate predation, and it had, in doing so, drawn him, and the world that watched him into her orbit. The label had begun as a tactic. It needed to be re-examined in the long light. She and Adonis had one of their longest conversations late in a cafe far from the downtown swirl, a quiet room that smelled faintly of espresso. Adonis's facade, which had been carved by years of decisions and armor, finally softened in the way he allowed his hands to rest on the table. He was not a man of many emotional effusions, but he could be present in the way he leaned in to listen. "You used my name," he said. "You called me husband in front of people who would otherwise have eaten you. And now?" Freya asked. "Is it still strategy for you?" He blinked. For a moment he looked like a man being reassembled from scattered parts. "It was strategy," he admitted, "at first, but strategy sometimes reveals what else is true. I am protective of what is mine to protect. But I need you to understand. Protection is not possession. If you ever feel caged, tell me. I am not asking you to call me anything you do not want to call me." The honesty, bare and unadorned, was not gratitude. It was not passion. It was an attempt at clarity, which in his world had always been a precursor to action. Freya, who had been taught to translate statements into motives by necessity, noticed the way his voice kept a measure of distance. She felt both warmth and a reluctance born of the way he grouped feelings into efficiencies. She told him the truth, that the label had saved her in the short term, but that she did not want her life to be defined by his image of her. "I am not your stunt," she said. "I did not want to be a prop in anyone's narrative." He nodded. "I do not wish to make you a prop," he replied simply. "I will not pretend that my means don't create power imbalances, because they do. I will try to reduce the imbalance. If you want to step out of the role I offered you, I will help build stairs, not walls." Some nights they were quiet together, a small domesticity forming, not an easy comfort, but a mutual testing of boundaries. He learned, with slow awkwardness, how to ask rather than to command. She learned how to accept practical help without mistaking it for ownership. Aiden became a friendly tether between them, small acts of care smoothing the edges of their alliance into something steadier. As the legal processes continued their plodding work, the world shifted focus. The Academy duel had been a public crucible, but the true test of Freya's claim was not only in art, but in the daily choices that followed. She took commissions on her own terms, turned down opportunistic offers that wanted myth without material justice, and taught a Saturday class to women at a community center that smelled of detergent and possibility. Painting took on a different hue when it was, at last, hers. Cordelia's redemption, if one could call it that, became an arc shaped by humility rather than spectacle. She completed a conservatory term, spent months apprenticing under Master Moonlight, and in one public statement took responsibility in a way that was small and official rather than performative. People debated the sincerity of her remorse. Freya, who had once been the ghost behind Cordelia's fame, chose an odd mercy. "We don't own each other's stories," she told a friend. "We can choose to make them true." Gale, who had once been a man who kept ledgers like bones in a cupboard, retreated into a smaller world. There was no dramatic prison scene. Instead, there was the slow recoil of a man who had built his life on extraction and found his creditors both financial and social. He paid fines and wrote apologies that read on paper like reduced confessions. In the privacy of his house, he tended to the ledger as a man tends a dying thing. The most dramatic public moment came months later, at a benefit exhibition where Freya's work was displayed in a long hall lined with people who had once been indifferent. The room hummed with newness, the smell of fresh varnish, the clink of glasses. Adonis stood by a painting as if it were a thing he had curated rather than commissioned. He had not demanded pronouncements this time. He had learned to let the world form its own judgments. But then a journalist, hungry for the hook that had made the story live months earlier, asked in a tone that implied both challenge and curiosity, "Do you still ask her to call you husband? Was that always part of your plan?" Adonis looked at Freya. There was something in his gaze, quiet, asking, that suggested the line had moved from armor to something else, or at least that he hoped it had. He turned to the room, and in a voice that carried no edge of command, said quietly, "I asked once to change the odds. If she agrees to call me husband, it will not be because I demand it as an ownership. If she chooses, she chooses. Do you choose, Eleanor?" The room fell silent in a way no headline can stage. People lean forward for spectacle and often recoil from real tenderness when it appears. Freya felt, in that moment, the entire arc of the last months tightening into one essential choice. Had the man beside her used power to fashion a shape that she could step into willingly? Had he become, in the work he did to protect her, someone who might choose to stand with her rather than over her? She looked at him, and saw not the man who had started as a cold protector, but a person who had used his privileges to cut out space for another's voice. She considered the nights when he had sat in council with her lawyers and conservators without making anything of it, the times he'd removed himself from deals rather than compromise her autonomy, the small gestures, phone calls to check whether she had eaten, the way he had advocated for her at a board meeting that might otherwise have dismissed her. "I choose," she said, and the words felt less like surrender and more like a binding of hands that both parties agreed to clasp. "I choose Adonis. But for the record, the name is mine to use with my own consent." He smiled, a small crack in his reserve. "Then we'll make it a choice, not an order." There was a tenderness in the way he offered her his arm that night, a pledge without pretense. They walked through the hall where her paintings hung like testimony, and the world, which had once pried at them like hungry hands, watched with something like approval. It was not a final victory. No single gesture could erase the years of theft and the memory of the sachet that had emptied a night's consent. But it was a turn. The label that had been a public tactic was now a mutual commitment, chosen rather than enforced. The aftermath of the legal battles was prosaic as much as dramatic. The Yeltons paid fines, Cordelia stepped into a quieter life of apprenticeship, Gale receded from public view, and Freya, Eleanor, found that the art world, always hungry for the next narrative, began to frame her as both survivor and artist. She was admitted to the National Artist Association without the caveat of provisionality. Her name appeared in columns that once ignored the hands behind masterpieces. She used her platform to speak about exploitation in creative industries, to lobby for clearer ethical standards, and to fund a small fellowship for anonymous artists who had been exploited by brands that favored story over substance. Adonis, for all his company holdings and board responsibilities, carved out time for things he had never done before. Weekend retreats at a small house by a river where Freya painted and he learned to cook, long walks where they argued about the right ratio of cadmium to medium, nights where neither of them required spectacle to be present with one another. The power balance, while never entirely equal, found a rougher symmetry. He learned to step back when she wanted space and to step forward when she asked for help. They negotiated public appearances with the same care they used to negotiate gallery terms. Every shared gesture had to be consented to, negotiated, and honored. Aidan found something he had been missing: work with integrity that did not require guarding another person's reputation at the expense of truth. He left Adonis's employ months after the trial and started a small consultancy to help artists with logistics, a company that combined protection with ethics. It was modest and not particularly lucrative, but it was satisfying in a way the old life had not been. Master Moonlight remained a figure of steady constancy, turning up at shows with a small fatalistic smile. He drank black tea and told rude jokes to younger artists who needed the comfort of someone irreverent enough to speak plainly. He watched Freya's growth as if it were his own fruit, and she repaid him by dedicating a show to him in which he displayed the ledger beside a new series that spoke of light returned after a long dark. There were public measures too. The Academy changed some of its policies about the verification of authorship. Legislators wrote small amendments that required more responsibility from galleries. The changes were not sweeping pandemics of reform, but they were stitches in a leaky garment. They mattered to those who had been hurt. The relationship between Freya and Adonis did not become a fairy tale. There were days when the memory of coercion, of the sachet and the hotel room, surfaced like a tide and left them both shivering. They attended counseling when Freya requested it. They negotiated intimacy with careful communication. The story's early ugly origin did not become a forgotten anecdote. It remained a scar and also a proof of survival. On a quiet Sunday, a year after the academy duel, Adonis took Freya to a small registry office rather than a cathedral. He wanted the step to be private, public enough for the law but small enough that it belonged to them without spectacle. She wore paint on her hands because she had been in the studio. He wore a suit that had been ironed with deliberate care. They exchanged vows in words they had written together, short, precise, nothing theatrical. They promised to protect one another's autonomy, to support each other's work, to never use power over the other's person. The ceremony was attended by Master Moonlight, Aiden, Aunt Meadow, Freya's mother, who smiled with the brittle joy of someone who had waited a long time to repair an old wrong, and a few friends from her first community classes. Cordelia sent a note of congratulations that was personal and not performative. The wedding did not feel like the moment headlines had once wanted it to be. It was quieter, an intimate claim that the label had finally become something Freya had chosen. She chose to be called by her real name and to take his name as a partnership rather than a surrender. The word husband, once demanded as a social shield on a morning that had been stolen from her, now sat in a different light, as a chosen title between two people who had both been altered by the way power had shaped them. In the years that followed, Freya's work continued to evolve. Her exhibitions wandered between the intimate and the grand, always returned to that leftward sweep that had become both a signature and an argument. She founded a small collective to help artists assert ownership, and to provide legal and conservator resources to those who had been instrumentalized by agencies and families who profited from others' labors. The collective was modest but relentless. Its presence prevented a few more abuses and gave others the vocabulary to ask for redress. There were quiet moments that looked like normalcy. Freya painted with sunlight pooling across her table while Adonis sat across the room reading a report. He would look up and smile at some small joke she made about the art market, and he would call her Eleanor, full name, intimate, and she would respond with a look that said, without words, "You were the one who taught me to insist on my name." Occasionally, someone in a social column would resurrect the old scandal in slim, voyeuristic terms, recounting the hotel morning as if it were a romantic plot twist rather than a crime. Freya would read these with a thin patience. The world loves sensationalism, she thought, and then she would turn back to her studio where the canvas awaited and the leftward flick would slide from her fingers like a claim. The city remembered Adonis both as a man of industry and as a man who had controversially used his place to change a narrative. People still argued about the ethics of the label he had once demanded. Was it protection? Was it possession? Freya had no interest in making the argument a public contest. Her answer to those who insisted on easy categorizations was simple. Context matters, and consent is everything. One late afternoon, standing in a studio that at last felt like hers, paint-smudged jeans, jars of solvent at the ready, light slanting as if to flatter the pigments, she looked over at Adonis across the room. He had his arm slung over the back of a chair. In front of him was an old ledger she'd given to him, a playful thing he'd insisted on keeping, not as a measure of her value but as a reminder of what they had overcome together. He called her with that old, somewhat clumsy tenderness, Eleanor, and she walked over and put her hand into his. They did not need to stage their life for anyone. They had chosen each other, and the choice was the truth that had finally, after a long battle with ledgers and labels, been made public and private and true. If you stayed with this story to the end, subscribe for more romantic dramas, and tell us in the comments, was his demand protection or possession?